Hey guys, and welcome back to the Dev Marketer channel. I'm your host, J.A. Curtis, but you guys can call me Alex. And in this video, we're going to be going over the new features of Laravel 5.4. Okay, so you guys know I'm a big fan of Laravel. We do a lot of Laravel stuff on this channel. Although the channel's not necessarily focused around Laravel, it's definitely my framework of choice. So we do a lot of talking about Laravel on this channel. Well, it feels like just yesterday that we were doing Laravel 5.3 when Laravel 5.3 came out. But now, as of January 2017, we're now moving up to Laravel 5.4. So I wanted to go ahead, and I know that last time the series where we talked about the new features coming to Laravel 5.3, I know it was very, very popular. And so I wanted to bring back a similar one for Laravel 5.4. What new features are coming to Laravel 5.4 and all that kind of stuff. Today's video, the first of the series, will be going over all the really small changes. I'm gonna go over the changelog here with you guys so you guys can see what changed. We'll talk about the big things. And then in the following videos, we'll go over kind of the bigger features. The features that basically require a dedicated video. But in today's video, we'll just focus on the really small snippets, the small features that just are worth mentioning, but maybe don't need their own, their entire video to go over. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about 5.4. What's the big difference between 5.3 and 5.4? What are my thoughts about the framework, where it's going, and stuff like that? First of all, I got to say the Laravel framework is incredible. It is growing at an incredible speed. It is really bringing PHP back into the cool factor, into the cool kids club. A lot of people are actually really considering PHP now to be something they can you can really put into production, which I know was kind of mocked before, and I'm sure there always will be those kinds of people. But then again, there's people in the Ruby community that mock the Python community, and the people in Python that mock the C#, and there's always going to be that. But I definitely think that it's Laravel has just really grown and really, really matured. I have absolutely no worries about putting a production level application into production with Laravel anymore. It is so solid. And it's just a really, really good framework. And actually, the biggest benefit to 5.4 is the fact that it's going to have even better performance and better security. So Taylor Otwell, the developer of Laravel, the guy, obviously it's open source, but he's the guy that that runs the project. And Taylor Otwell mentioned that he went through and refactored everything. He went through every class in the Laravel framework. He went through every single class and refactored it, made sure that whatever he was doing in that class made sense, and rewrote it to perform better or to be more secure and to be more readable. So if you want to dive into the framework to know how something is working, he made it so that you could understand it better. He mentioned actually that sometimes he would dive into some of these classes and he couldn't even figure out how he had written it because he had written it maybe years ago. And so he really went back through with the idea of writing it so that it, first of all, made sense and it was easy for us to read, had really good performance and really good security. And so that's the biggest benefit, I'd say, to switching from 5.3 to 5.4 is that the whole framework has really been refactored and re-optimized. Okay, so that's a really, really good thing. And that adds a lot of confidence when you start thinking about putting a large-scale application into production. And Laravel is definitely capable of that. It's really, really good. I have some really high-level applications in production, Laravel works remarkably. It is fast and efficient. It's just awesome. Okay, so as far as upgrading from 5.3 to 5.4, if you do have an application running on 5.3 right now and you want to upgrade it, the good news is the 5.4 upgrade is actually really, really easy. When we switched from 5.2 to 5.3, it was a difficult transition because there was actually a lot of file changes and code changes, and there were some significant hurdles you had to overcome to upgrade a 5.2 application into the 5.3 space. And so I know a lot of people that are running production apps right now that are still on 5.2 because of how difficult it was to upgrade from 5.2 to 5.3. And I know a lot of people that are still kind of stuck there because of that upgrade process. The good news is that if you are running a 5.3 application, Upgrading now to the newest version in 5.4 is actually really easy. I'm going to go ahead and link the upgrade guide down below, but it can be found on Laravel's website, laravel.com. In the documentation under the upgrade guide, you can see what it takes to upgrade from 5.3 to 5.4. So if you are running a 5.3 application, it is actually relatively simple. The good news is most of the work is going to be handled by Composer. It's going to pull in that refactoring. Everything's basically backward compatible in 5.3 or 5.4 from where it was in 5.3, which is awesome. And there are a few things that if you go through the upgrade guide, it'll mention, you basically want to read through the whole thing. And if you're using some of these more obscure methods, then you may need to actually go through and change those method names. But other than that, you can basically do a Composer update and be able to do an upgrade. Now, don't run a Composer update without looking at the guide first. In fact, let me just go over there and show you guys, but I'll link it down in the description so you can find it. But if you go to Laravel 5. Or Laravel.com, go to the documentation. Over here at the top, you'll see your upgrade guide. And I've gone through and read this. I'm actually going to be preparing an application for upgrade soon. And it's not too bad. It's okay. Obviously, you're going to upgrade your dependencies, and then it's going to go through everything. You're obviously going to want to clear a cache and do all of that kind of stuff. But for the most part, you just want to read through this and see if you're using any of these plugins or these methods, and then you'll just want to change them as needed. So as you can see here, like Laravel Cashier doesn't need any changes. Laravel Passport. It's now using Axios JavaScript library, wasn't before, so you just do a little change there. A lot of these here are just ready to go. So you basically just want to go through these, so for example, if you're using this get policy for method, which a lot of people aren't, but if you were, you would make this change. And so when I was going through and looking at a lot of these, again, you only really need to make changes if you're using a few of these methods, and none of them are really common methods. So on your application, there might only be one or two things you need to change, and you'll be ready to upgrade. So before you change that Composer, and then do a Composer update, you're going to want to go through and read the guide, but it's pretty simple. Okay. So anyway, upgrades are simple. Laravel's in a really good place. It's awesome. And let's now talk about the changes. So I mentioned we're going to go over all the small changes. Let's dive into those now and talk about kind of what you can expect going into Laravel 5.4. First of all, if you are running through Composer here and you want to install a new application, you can install it the way you always have. Laravel new, and then I'm just going to call my application here Laravel 5.4 for 5.4. And it's going to run the Composer. I have noticed that 5.4 is a longer install, at least for me it was, but not too bad. Okay, so let's dive into 5.4 here, and I just want to mention a few things in the code, and then we'll go into the changelog and look at those. Okay, so I'm going to open this up here in Atom, and the first thing I wanted to mention real quick is, and keep in mind that there'll be some following videos for some of the more advanced features, but these are going to go over all the small things. The one thing I wanted to mention with the code here is that, first of all, if you go to your routes, you will notice there's now 4 different channels for routes. We have an API channel, which we had before, the web channel, which we had at the beginning of 5.3. We had both of those. Partway through 5.3, we did get the console channel as well. And this is if you wanted to write artisan commands, artisan routes. And then now we have a channels as well for doing subscriptions and broadcast channels if you're doing anything with Redis or Pusher or something like that. So just kind of mention that in the routes. But again, you don't need to worry about those if you're upgrading, but you'll see those now if you pull in a new application. The other thing I wanted to show you guys is if you go into resources and into your JavaScript file, your app.js, this is obviously where you're going to mix everything. I call it mix now because that's the new version, Laravel mix. But if you're going to be using Webpack or Gulp, Gulp is no longer used. The Laravel Elixir no longer uses Gulp as its compiler. It now uses Webpack primarily, and we use it all through NPM. And that's one of the biggest changes, I guess, that I noticed right from the get-go, is that we're using NPM to run your pre-processing. So if you're processing your JavaScript or your Sass files, you're going to be doing that through NPM now. And I'll have a different video focused on that because there's a lot to do with that. But the one thing I did want to mention, you'll notice I don't have my node modules in here yet because I haven't ran yarn. In the past, after you run a Laravel new application, you usually would want to run yarn, right? And it would come in, there's a yarn.lock file in here, it would pull in all those node modules, and then you'd have your node modules here in your project, right? That's how it used to be, and then you could start using Gulp, and which Laravel Elixir, which was built on top of Gulp. So you could start using Gulp to process all your JavaScript and your CSS. The biggest change that I noticed is that you don't do that anymore. So instead of using Yarn, I do recommend, at least right now, we're in February of 2017 right now, and as of right now, Yarn doesn't work if you're using the preprocessors, at least in my experience. I know that virtually every Windows user I've talked to has had this problem, and then a lot of the Mac users have. And I don't know why some of the Mac users have and some don't, but I mean, I know the good majority of people are having problems running Yarn with Laravel. So instead of running Yarn, you're going to want to do an npm install. So you're using npm instead of Yarn, at least right now. And I don't know if this is going to get fixed or not, but I was getting a lot of errors when I was running Yarn that certain things it wasn't able to pull in certain dependencies and stuff. And it has to do with the binary related to Laravel Elixir, and I don't know all the details of it, but that's what's causing the problems. So until further notice, you're going to want to use npm install instead of Yarn when booting up in Laravel 5.4. Now, the downside with npm install is how long it takes, as you can see here. Yarn would have been done by now, but regardless, you got to run npm install to pull in all of those stuff. So I want to pull this in real quick, and then I'm going to show you guys how the bootstrap.js has changed, which is kind of what I wanted to do with all this. Okay, so here you're getting the npm collection. These are all the things it pulls in. There's a lot of crap here. This is almost turning into a JavaScript framework more than a... It's funny when you boot stuff into GitHub, you know how like GitHub has the graph at the top where it shows like how much JavaScript you have, PHP and CSS and all that stuff. When you put a fresh, like when you do a git commit and do an initial commit and you throw it up onto GitHub, you're going to get, it's like 78%, I think. If you just do an initial commit where before you start writing your code and you just commit the framework, you'll get 78% is JavaScript. And that's while ignoring node modules, because in your git ignore, you should have node modules ignored. And that's ignoring node modules. You still have that much, which is crazy. But anyway, that's just kind of an interesting thing. Okay, so there we go. So we pulled that in. Now I want to show you guys in your app.js, which is going to be your main compiled JavaScript file, you've got your bootstrap that you're going to pull in. You can see that Vue is also utilized right in here. That's how it was in 5.3 though. If we go into bootstrap.js though, this is what I'm going to show you guys now, is that Lodash, and I can't remember if this, I don't think this was in 5.3, but Lodash is now included and is brought in on every new Laravel application. Of course, you could get rid of it if you don't want it. I love Lodash. Lodash, by the way, for those that don't know, is just like it's a bunch of JavaScript helper functions. If you go to Lodash, I don't remember their website, but lodash.com. So this is Lodash. It's a JavaScript library that what it basically does is it basically gives JavaScript a lot of the helper functions that PHP has. So if you go here to the documentation, you can see like just basic stuff like being able to chunk arrays, to find an index of an array, to join arrays. These are all the array functions, as you can find. There's collection functions. There's custom stuff here, language functions. Some of these math, you can get really good with. I used this the other day for round. JavaScript doesn't really have a good round function built in like PHP does. So if you need a JavaScript version, Lodash allows you to find that. You can find minimums, floors, ceilings. Anyway, all that kind of stuff is kind of just all these helper functions come with Lodash, and that's now included with brought in through npm with Laravel 5.4. We also still get jQuery. I know a lot of people are getting anti-jQuery now, so if you are anti, you can get rid of that. But it pulls in Bootstrap Sass, which is all the Bootstrap JavaScript functions. So if you're using Bootstrap, there's all the JavaScript portion of Bootstrap that it pulls in. Again, if you're not using Bootstrap, you can go ahead and kill that and then recompile your recompile the JavaScript file. And then it pulls in Vue and it pulls in Axios. So that's what I wanted to show you guys, is that I know in 5.3 it was pulling in Bootstrap, jQuery, and Vue, but now it also pulls in Axios and Lodash. So just wanted to mention that. Also, I think partway through 5.3 it added this, but now, well, it added it to jQuery headers. Now it adds it to Axios headers. But now every Axios, which, by the way, Axios, for those who don't know, if you're using Vue, well, you don't need Vue to do it. You can use any JavaScript. But Axios is a basically an Ajax HTTP library. It's like a JavaScript version of Guzzle, which is really cool. Super easy to use. If you guys want a tutorial on how to use it, we used Axios at the end of the Vue series. So if you go to the Vue.js series on my channel, I showed you guys how to use Axios. And we went out to an API. When someone typed in a zip code, we went out to the API to get the city name and city state. And we used Axios to do that. So back then we were using 5.3, so we had to pull in Axios, but now it's actually brought in to the framework right here from the beginning. And then the other nice thing is that the CSRF tokens are actually attached to the headers right here in the JavaScript file, which is really, really nice. Now you'll have CSRF tokens applied to your JavaScript or to your Axios Ajax headers when you submit an HTTP request, which is awesome. That makes it really, really easy. Okay, and then you can uncomment this out also if you're using Laravel Echo, and this will pull in Laravel Echo and subscribe you to channels and so forth. Okay, so wanted to mention that. That's one thing that has changed. But other than that, there's no major code changes that I wanted to go over. So the rest we can just go over to the changelog and take a look at those. So let's kind of head back over there. And I'm going to link this down in the description if you want to follow along. But these are basically the release notes for Laravel 5.4. We're currently in version 5.4.10, but we're going to go through all of them since the 5.4 update. Last thing I wanted to mention also while we are here is if you are wondering what version of Laravel your application is running on, all you need to do is go into your Laravel project. So you can see here I'm in this new project we just created. And you just want to run PHP artisan -- version and then click enter. And this will tell you the version that you're using of Laravel. Okay, so this is 5.4.10. But if you were on, say, an old version, let me just see real quick if I've got... Okay, so let me pull into this project and I run a PHP artisan. This should be 5.3 -- version. You can see, oh wow, I updated. Oh, sorry, this is a different framework. This one is what I was thinking. Okay. Okay, so this one should be 5.3. Yeah, 5.3.19. So it'll tell you what version you are, and then you can go through and update it. So if you are wondering what version your application is running on, you can do this PHP artisan -- version to get it. Because I know that's a question a lot of people had last time. When they weren't sure what version they were using, they're asking how they could tell. Okay, so there is a lot of changes here in the changelog that I'm going to fly through them, and I'm just going to mention the big ones. So obviously the big ones will have their own videos. I'm going to mention some of the bigger ones that are worth mentioning. A lot of the changes on here are optimization changes, meaning that they are things that kind of are behind the scenes that if you're not diving into the deep framework, you don't really need to be too concerned about. Their optimization changes, improvements, bug fixes, and stuff like that. So I'm going to just kind of go over the things worth mentioning that are you're going to notice on the front end as a developer. So the first one I actually want to mention here is the very first one, this prepend directive. And I'm actually going to go through and kind of show you guys more about Laravel. Laravel Blade has improved a lot in 5.4, which is one thing I've noticed. And then also a little bit last in 5.3 as well. But one of the things they added in 5.3 was this idea of a stack. You could create a stack, like if you have a bunch of JavaScript files you want to add, and you want to add them dynamically, you could create, say, a stack called JS files in your Blade documents. And then on each page that you included, you could say push, as you see up here, you could then push another file onto it. And it would just append it to the end of that stack. So when you actually render that stack, it'll grab all the pushes that are on all the different files throughout your documents. It'll grab all of them, put them all together, and just stack them one on the end of the other. And then you'll have this stack with maybe all your JavaScript files, or I don't know how else you would use it. It makes most sense with JavaScript and CSS files when you're including these. And that way you can kind of include them dynamically, and they all get pushed onto the end of them. So anyway, that's the stack. This has been around since 5.3. Push is how you would add new things to the stack. That's been around since 5.3. But now we have a prepend. So now if you want to push something onto the beginning of that stack instead of the end of the stack, you can use prepend, which is pretty cool. So for example, let's take a look here. Let's say we're in our main layout file. You create a stack called letters in this case. And then you've got your main file. It's extending your layout file, right? And your layout file is where you define the stack. And then you wanted to push a new thing onto that stack. So you're pushing it onto the letters stack, right? So it's going to go into here, and you're pushing the A letter. That's the content that you're pushing up onto this stack. You can also do this as a chunk if you don't want to do it inline. But anyway, in this example, they're doing it inline. Now, this would put it onto the end of the stack, which it doesn't look like anything's defined in the stack. So the stack is now just A. But when you prepend it, you can now add to the beginning of the stack, you're adding B, which means now the stack is going to be BA. Does that make sense? Because you put it to the beginning. Now you can see here we've got another one. It extends master. If we assumed that these all were rendering at the same time, then this would push it to the end of the stack. This would push it to the beginning. So now you'd have D, B, A. Let's see, D, B, A, C is what you would have. So anyway, just something to oh, here it is, B, D, A, C, A. So anyway, just something to think about. That's a pretty cool one that you can have this prepend. Now you can push something onto the beginning of the stack or to the end of the stack. I think that's a pretty cool one. It's something that I haven't had a use case for it, but it's something that's, I think, good to have there. The other thing I want to mention is this number 2 here, the tap method. The tap method allows you to basically tap into a collection partway through. So here's a perfect example. You can see here you're sorting the collection, and then you can tap into it and log something directly inside of there. So it's kind of like putting it aside, using something in the collection, and then you can continue to group and do something like that. So that's another pretty cool function that you can run these functions directly inside of a collection inline, which is pretty cool. Okay, that's basically, these are all added in 5.4.10. So these are the newest version of Laravel. You may not have if you've already upgraded a few of your applications. You'll need to upgrade to the most recent version to get this. Now, there wasn't a lot in 5.4 other than some nice improvements. For example, let's see, relative URLs in Mix, and nothing in here else was overly needed to mention. What I wanted to mention, though, is in 5.4.7, we do now have the break. Let's see, where is it? Break and continue. Here it is up here. So I wanted to mention these real quick. You can now add numeric arguments to break and continue. This is pretty cool. Again, in your blade files, if you're doing a loop, a blade loop, let's see, here's a perfect example. You're doing a loop or an if statement, and you wanted to break the statement, or you wanted to tell it to continue. They don't have an example for it here, but you wanted to use the break or continue commands. You can now tell it to go multiple layers deep, just like the normal PHP break and PHP continue. Okay, so what that means is that here you can tell it to break, here using blade, you can do break 2, and that'll tell it to break 2 layers up, okay? So that's pretty cool that you always had break, you always had continue, but now you can add the numeric arguments to it to go multiple layers out. Whereas if you wanted to use those numeric arguments before, you would have had to wrap it in PHP instead of using the actual blade syntax. So anyway, just kind of another nice thing that's been added. Let's see, what else do we got? Oh, double quotes in section. Let's see where that is. Here it is. So double quotes in section is now nice. I actually had this problem before. It was driving me crazy. When you're doing a section, before you could only have single quotations in there, but now they support double quotes, which is nice. All right, what's next? 5.4.6, it brings, this is something that I'll show you guys real quick in function, but basically now you can generate models with your controllers, which is awesome because you could do migrations of models Like you could generate a migration and generate a model with it. Or sorry, no, you could generate a model and then generate a migration. I don't know if you could generate a migration and a model, but if you generated a model, you could do a migration with it. And then you could generate a controller, but you couldn't do a controller and a migration, and now you can. So over here in terminal, let's go ahead and do it. Let's go into our Laravel project. And let's go ahead and say we want to create a new controller in here. So what we can do, PHP artisan make controller, nothing new here, right? Let's call it the post controller for our posts, our blog post or something. And now you can pass in a flag where you can pass in -- model, and you can create a model called posts. Okay, so this is all one line. And now you can create this new model called post. And when you click enter, it'll actually ask you if it exists or not. So if you want to attach a controller to an existing model, you can actually do that as well, which is really nice. Or if you don't have the model, then you can create a new one. So you have both of those options in here, which is pretty cool. It defaults to yes to generate a new model. You click enter, and now you're going to create a model and a controller. So now inside of our project, we should have our model and our controller. So you have app, you've now got a post model that was created, and then you've got a controller, post controller, and the post controller is already tied to the post model, which is sweet. And by default, it's a resourceful controller, which is now the new default when you tie it to models. So anyway, just something cool to think about. Anyway, that was a cool change. Next, 5.4. Let's see, 4.0. Let's go down to. There's a lot of little bug changes here that happened right between 4.0 and 4.6. But let's just dive down here to 5.4.0. First thing I want to show you guys is there's two new helper functions. The first one, I'll actually pull in the documentation, is the retry helper function. This allows you to retry a function multiple times with an optional parameter to sleep in between. So if you want to try something until it works, then the retry helper is available throughout the entire Laravel project. You can use retry, and then you just tell it how many times to try. Then you give it what the function you want it to render, and then you can optionally give it a sleep in milliseconds, how many times to sleep between tries. So this could be something handy in custom situations where you're doing this. I don't know. All this is going to be sitting in some sort of request. So it makes more sense to do this in events, but we already had that function in events, but now it's brought into the whole framework. So anyway, there's probably some cool applications there. Just wanted to mention that it's now available. Again, this is the first parameter is how many times it should try. The second parameter is the function to run. The third parameter is how many milliseconds to sleep between attempts. And as long as it returns anything that's not an exception, it'll break the retry. So if it works on the first time, as long as it returns something that's not an exception, then it will continue to work. If it returns an exception, then it'll sleep for 100 milliseconds or whatever you give it, and then it will run again. So that's a new helper function you've got. We also have array wrap. Array wrap function is pretty basic. It just allows you to basically wrap an item in an array if needed, and you can use it dynamically if you don't know whether the item is wrapped or not. So it's just kind of a handy function. You can see down here, this is the code for it. Basically, if it's not an array, then it will wrap it in an array. Otherwise, it just returns it. And that way you know you would have an array just to work with. Just nice little helper function. We also now, by default, have a default 503 error page that comes with the framework. What else do I got here? So I've got notes over here on the other screen, the things I wanted to mention real quick. Inline sections are now escaped, which is cool. Here we go. So when you're doing a section like this and you're doing it inline, like I do a lot of times with like a title, oh, that's what this guy's doing too, you can now, it'll now escape it basically. So this is really, really nice. We had this problem a lot when we were did the How to Build a Blog with Laravel program. It wasn't escaped by default, so we had to do some funky stuff to make it work. We basically had to do this, but now it's escaped by default, so something cool to think about. Nice little change. Since I use those inline sections a lot, I wanted to mention that. Even though it's a simple change, it's worth mentioning. Another item is collections. So let's go down to collections here. Collection, a random collection now will return another collection. Now this is confusing maybe when I just explain it, but this is really nice because whenever we do collection methods, I remember in 5.3, whenever you ran a query builder, it started to return a collection. And that makes it a lot easier because you kind of always know you're working with a collection. So you can always use those collection methods on whenever you do a query or anything like that, because you know it's going to come back as a collection. So now another thing is if you're pulling the random function off of a function, if you just run random with no parameter inside, it will default pull one random item out of that collection, right? And it will pull it just as a singular item. So it'll pull it as basically an object or an array, but it won't be a collection object. So it'll just be an array. However, if you pass in a number parameter now, it'll actually give you a collection in return, which is nice because then you can continue to do other collection stuff with it because it's actually a collection object. So if you just want one item in return, if you just pass the number 1 into the random function, it'll do the same thing that it does without the parameter, but it will return a collection now instead of just an array. Okay? And of course, if you want to pass in multiple numbers, which you could do this before, 2, 3, it'll grab 3 random items out of that collection and return all those items as a collection. But now if you pass in 1, it'll also return a collection. So it just makes it a little easier to work with there. What else do I got here in my notes I wanted to mention? Okay, key generate command. I'll just mention this because it's not worth looking at. Now when you run the key generate command, PHP artisan key generate, and you're doing that in production, it'll now have a confirmation that you have to agree to in order to run that generate command. This is a good thing because if you already say have a key ran, it'll be good to double check that. It's just kind of a nice little safety feature. It already does this with migrations, so it just makes it a little more consistent across the board with Laravel. That's one thing I think I like about Laravel. The collections is another perfect example of that. Consistency. Like whenever you run these collection items, being able to get another collection in return just helps with the consistency. Running Query Builder returns a collection. Consistency, right? You just makes it very consistent. Now when you're in production, whenever you run migrations or generate keys, stuff like that, it requires confirmation. Just consistency just makes the whole thing a lot nicer. Tinker, PHP Artisan Tinker now is its own external package. Just another thing to mention, you shouldn't really need to worry about this, but you will notice if you go into your config app and you start looking at all the packages it's brought in, Tinker is its own package. So now if you want to run the Tinker commands, you still can, it's just its own package. So just something to think about. And I think, well, anyway, we won't get into it. I think it pulls it in as a deb dependency. So on your production server, you may not have Tinker unless you specifically require it for production. Okay, now when you're pulling in, another item here is weekends. This is a pretty cool one. That's why I wanted to mention it. And this, I think, has a lot of use for a lot of people. But when you're running these events or you're running these tasks, sometimes you want to run them at low times in the day when you don't get a lot of traffic. And for a lot of applications, the weekends are one of those times. If you're running a business application like a CRM or something like that, you don't get a lot of traffic on those types of sites on the weekends, okay? So sometimes that's a really good time to do. The weekends are good times to run events or tasks that will require a lot of CPU because you're not going to have a lot of other traffic, so you can allocate that. You'll have a lot of free space. You can use that CPU to run these CPU intensive tasks. So now when you're creating when you're scheduling an event, you can schedule it for the weekends, which is kind of cool. So just like anything, you have your event, schedule it between 2 and 6 on the weekends only, and then you run the command. So just something to think about. That's another kind of cool one that they've added. Again, a lot of these are just small little things, but they're nice quality of life changes, as we mentioned. Okay, let's now look at Mailable. There's a bunch of stuff in Mailable. Okay, so now with Mailable, you now have access to commands such as has2, hascc, and hasbcc. So if you want to, inline when you're setting up your Mailable, you can now set the recipient to, the recipient carbon copy, the CC, or the blind carbon copy, the BCC. Let's just see how that works real quick. So, well, this doesn't really show it. But anyway, when you're running a mailable, you can just attach this, arrow has BCC and then the recipient's address. Optionally, you can also add their name. And you can just keep chaining these BCC, these CC, and these to commands to add multiple recipients if you want. This is a really nice change that's going to be kind of good to have because you don't need to do this in the mailable class. You can actually do this when you call the method dynamically. So I think that's really, really nice. Also related to that is, let's see, there was one other one. We're going to talk about the markdown emails in its own video, but let me look at my notes here. Okay, Mailable now has a salutation option, which I thought was cool. Let's pull open that real quick. Okay, so now when you have a new Mailable class like this, and you generate your mail, you can now have another line item that says salutation. We had one before called greeting, which was cool. So you could change the greeting from hello, good morning, whatever. You could change the greeting, which is the, it's kind of the item at the top of the mail. And then usually you have your content, your button or whatever. And then at the very bottom, it would say, I think it says cheers. Is that the default? Regards. Regards is the default. So then at the bottom, it'll say regards, application admin or IT staff or something. So now you can change that salutation at the end, that regards, you can change it to anything else. So in this case, he put cheers. Anyway, that's a cool one. I think that's really good. It, again, made it more consistent. Since you already had greeting, now you have salutation. It's just like also with the prepend and the, you can do prepend, you can do push when you're working with stacks. It all just adds consistency. Like you could do it here, but why not here? Same with the collection item we talked about. You could do, whenever you pulled one random item out, it was an array, but when you did 2 or 3 items, it was a collection. So why is there not that consistency? And so it's a lot of consistent elements I noticed in 5.4. All right, we're almost done here. Now let's talk about Redis. So Redis is kind of the last big thing worth mentioning. Redis now supports PHP Redis instead of pre-Redis, which is what it used before for a library. PHP Redis is going to be a faster library, theoretically at least. So that's really cool. Second of all, we now support multiple Redis clusters. This is really good for really big applications where you might have multiple Redis clusters. Now you can use that out of the box with Laravel, which is awesome. And then you can see a few other Redis things here, which is cool. And then the last thing I'll mention here is in validations. We have a couple new validation things. For example, we now have validations for IPv4 and IPv6, which is cool. The date format is more precise. And then also sometimes, if you use the sometimes command, it's now chainable because it returns this. Before it didn't return this, this object. What I mean by this is, if you look here at the code. So it didn't used to return anything. Now it returns this. So because it returns this, you can chain it with other commands, which is great. So that's the other thing to mention. And that's basically it. So those are kind of all the small changes for Laravel 5.4, I'm sorry. A lot of changes for quality of life and consistency. Those are kind of all the things I wanted to go over today, just so you guys are aware of that. I'm going to link this here in the description if you want to go through and read any of these changes in more detail. I flew through it because you guys can see how long this is. There's actually a lot of stuff in here. And so it might be worth your time just reading through this. And what's great is whenever you're working on something in here, there's always the commits or the issues. So the issues have number signs in front of them. The commits look like this. So you can click on these commits and it will take you to that commit and you can actually read the code that he talks about. So this upgrade guide, or sorry, this isn't the upgrade guide. This change log is awesome. I highly recommend going through and reading it. So I'm going to link that below that you can take a look at on your own time to go over some of the stuff that I skipped over, because I did skip over a lot, but I wanted to mention the ones worth mentioning in this video, because a lot of these were like here, for example, Jedi. Jedi now is an uncountable object. You can't have plural Jedis. There's no such thing as Jedis. That's kind of a funny one because I don't know how many applications use Jedi, but anyway, one Jedi, multiple Jedis. It's like a moose or multiple moose. That's an uncountable list. Jedi got added to that list. So that really wasn't worth mentioning. There's a lot of things like that aren't really worth mentioning, but you can go through and read and just know that they're there. A lot of these things are little bug fixes and things like that. So go ahead, and I recommend reading this. I'll also link in the description the upgrade guide. You can also find it by going to the documentation, going to upgrade guide. You may want to read through this if you're upgrading an application. Just make sure you're not using any of these, these functions. Just keep things in mind, like here, Guzzle 6.0 is required for Laravel. Just things like that are good to go over. Make sure your application's up to date and things like that. Okay, in the following videos, we're going to go over some of the features in more detail, the bigger features of Laravel 5.4, things such as adding mail. Let's see, what do we got? Markdown emails. I'm going to go over the new Laravel Elixir. We got a bunch of stuff that we're going to go over, and I'll have each of those broken out into their own videos that'll be much shorter than this video. So thanks so much for tuning in today, guys. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I hope you guys are excited for Laravel 5.4. Let me know your favorite feature down below. It could be this one of the ones we talked about here. It could be one of the bigger features that we're going to do in future videos. But go ahead and just comment below and let me know what your favorite feature is for Laravel 5.4, what you're really looking forward to. Or maybe it's just the refactoring or something like that. Anyway, let me know, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you guys in the next video.